Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have Professor Rory Truex here with us today. I'm going to read his bio and then we're going to jump right into the first question. Rory Truex is Associate Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University, where his research and teaching focuses on Chinese politics and authoritarian systems. In 2021, he received the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching, the highest teaching honor at Princeton. His commentary on China and U.S.-China relations has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and South China Morning Post, among other outlets. He's the founder and host of the Civic Forum, a weekly webinar on democracy featuring leading scholars and practitioners. He writes the Living in Truth Substack about democracy and authoritarianism. Thank you for being with us today and welcome.
Thank you so much, Maina.
Jumping right in, so as you know, Begins With Us is an organization aimed at informing young people about current issues. We're thrilled to have you as our guest, as this will be our first podcast focused on foreign policy, international relations, and America's interactions on the global stage. With this in mind, could you please share with our audience your areas of current focus as a professor at Princeton and how these priorities have evolved in the past few years? What motivated you to focus either on certain topics or on certain countries?
So I study Chinese politics, like the nature of China's political system. And I also do some research on US-China relations. And my interest in these topics actually started probably when I was around your age. I had a high school teacher, Jeffrey Mosier, who was also my basketball coach. And before I went to college, he told me, Rory, you should study Chinese. China is going to be important. And this was in the early 2000s. And so when I got to college, I just started studying Chinese on a whim. I started going to China, spending time there, and just became really interested in the political system. And ever since then, I've just tried to study the country as much as I can. And as we know, China is growing increasingly important. Mr. Mosher was right, gave me good life advice. And so that's what I focus my teaching and research on at Princeton these days.
As you said, you got your motivation from a teacher. So, for high school students and even adults of all ages, American foreign policy for some of us isn't always a front burner issue. But as our world is increasingly interconnected economically, digitally, and public health, as we saw with the pandemic, it seems that we all should be more informed and focused on foreign policy. For you, not only as a professor, but also as a scholar focused on politics and international affairs, why is this focus on foreign policy so important? And why should all people, but especially young people, care?
Well, I think what you just said is really important, which is that for many people, many voters, foreign policy is sort of an afterthought. And it's not something that really turns elections. When we look at data in political science, we tend to say that American voters don't really pay too close attention to foreign policy. And I think it's important for people, especially young people, to start paying attention to this area, if only because a lot of the challenges we face are global in nature. If we look ahead at the next 10, 20, 30 years, the big threats to humanity, some of them even existential threats, are global. They're interconnected. They require multiple countries working together to really solve them adequately. So we look at climate change, of course. We used to talk a lot about nuclear war, nuclear proliferation, obviously public health, pandemics. We've just experienced that collectively. And then increasingly, people are talking about AI and misaligned AI and the threat of that might pose. So all of these challenges require countries to coexist. They require countries to work together, governments to work together. And this can be especially challenging in a world where democracy is at stake, where the world is increasingly authoritarian, and that poses challenges to cooperation. So I do think it's an issue area where I think young people need to be paying attention and need to figure out how they think about these issues. And there is no one right way to think, but it's important to begin to pay attention.
Branching off on what you just said about, framing the way that we think, I think many of our listeners probably have some preconceptions about life in China based largely on where they get their news from or where in the world they are. From approximately, and I know this is broad, but from approximately the start of this century, would you mind providing a roadmap of major political trends, the landscape of actors and parties, and what the issues are that affect China through the present?
Yeah, so China is governed by a ruling party called the Chinese Communist Party. It's a one-party state, so it means that there are no opposition parties, there are no meaningful elections. This is an authoritarian system, and so that means political rights and human rights are seriously curtailed. That said, China is not North Korea. I think a lot of people, before they travel to China, do have this misconception And one of the kind of recurring themes is that when people set foot in China for the first time, it's completely different than what they imagine. There's a high quality of life, a lot higher quality than people might think. There's a high level of repression and background surveillance, of course, but for the most part, people go about their everyday lives. And so there's this sort of disconnect between what China is actually like on the ground and what we might think about it from afar. And so I'm a big proponent of when and where possible, traveling for those who can afford it or for those who have opportunities to do so through school, trying to get to see different parts of the world and develop your own impressions. I think that's really important. The one trend I did want to, there are two trends actually I think I should highlight for your listeners. The first is, of course, China's growing economic power. So China has been on a steady upward trajectory basically since the 1980s. And it is fast approaching GDP parity with the United States. And that's GDP, the kind of total economic output. But the economy is slowing. And so China's growth model that carried it for the last 30 years does not seem to be the growth model that will carry it for the next 30. So it's at a bit of an inflection point. The other big trend to note is that China has become increasingly authoritarian in the last basically 12 to 13 years. It is currently ruled by a president named Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping is a bit of a strong man. He's consolidated power around himself. He's developed a cult of personality. He's really cracked down on civil society, a lot of different groups, women, LGBTQ community, the environmental community, a lot of different kind of societal groups have been a target under Xi Jinping. And so China is increasingly a darker place and a more repressive place. Certain communities, like the Uyghur community in Xinjiang, have been subject to sustained human rights abuses. And so it's a country that's quite dynamic, but in my opinion, is sort of headed in the wrong direction, and that has created challenges on the international stage.
I'd love to get to the human rights repression and political dissent in a second, but sticking with the economy first, in the topic of tariffs. Since the 2024 election, there's a lot of focus on US tariffs against China, and we've seen that China is not slow or hesitant to protect its economic interests in response. Could you please frame this tariff issue in a broader context? What's going on here? Why is it happening? And well, it's hard to predict what may happen. What are some realistic scenarios which could play out?
So fundamentally, what's at stake here is whether or not how the U.S. and China and the rest of the world more broadly, how their economic relationship will look. And for many decades, the basic model was that China had a very cheap currency, had cheap labor, and that meant that it basically became the world's factory. And so, starting in the 1980s, Western companies began to invest more in China and eventually move manufacturing to China. And China benefited from that. Its economic growth was driven by this manufacturing model. It became the manufacturer for the world. Now, what I think people are realizing these days is that in doing so, this hollowed out manufacturing in many developed countries, including the United States. And that hurt quite a lot of people. It put a lot of people out of work. And this is often referred to as what's known as the China shock, the shock of China's access to the global market as a shock to labor, particularly in the developed world. And so the underlying argument behind the tariffs for the Trump administration is that the tariffs will protect American markets and allow manufacturing to return, and that will create jobs for people. That's the underlying argument. I personally am skeptical about whether that will actually come to pass. My personal view is that the way the Trump administration is using tariffs is quite random and haphazard. They seem to come and go quite quickly. There's a lot of bargaining, and I'm skeptical that Western companies, American companies, are going to look at this and try to bring manufacturing back, given just how erratic the Trump administration has been. And so I tend to think of it as much more chaotic, despite this underlying logic. And then on the Chinese side, this is core to their growth model, and the stability of the entire political and economic system requires steady economic growth. And if all of a sudden the tariffs hurt Chinese manufacturers, they hurt the Chinese economy, that does threaten Xi Jinping, that does threaten the Chinese Communist Party. So that's why we're seeing this sort of intractable conflict over tariffs, because really the stakes of the game are very high. Now, you asked me, what do I see as possible paths? It's hard for me to predict, and I'm not an economist, so I will try to be humble about what I know. But I would say there's one path, which is what we would call decoupling. And decoupling is the broad idea that the two economies will begin to really separate. And so supply chains for different companies will be moved out of China and be moved back to the US or other countries that are not authoritarian, that are closer to the American value system. And that will leave the two economies less entangled with each other. The other path is some sort of equilibrium is reached where leaders on both sides realize they kind of need each other. The economic damage to both sides is so great that we see perhaps some more protectionism, but still a fair amount of trade and intertwined manufacturing going on. I think that's generally where we're headed. There seems to be talk that Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are trying to hash something out with respect to tariffs. And so I do think we will reach some sort of agreement soon that will stabilize things. But it is still up in the air.
Thank you for sharing that and kind of mapping out the different pathways that might happen. Flipping over to the social side and talking about human rights again, as you mentioned briefly, repression and political dissent. I think many of our listeners, especially my generation in the US, hear negative impressions about China's protection of human rights, which you also touched on, and of the freedom of dissenters to voice their opinion. And just last week, we commemorated the anniversary of the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. It seems, though, that these topics, at least in the US, come into sharper focus in the discussion of trade agreements and global events such as the Olympics. Are these impressions legitimate, and what is the path forward?
So I think the human rights issue will always be there with respect to China. This is a system, any authoritarian government is predicated on some degree of repression. And by authoritarian, I just mean a government that does not rule through the use of free and fair elections. So in any system where people cannot directly choose their leaders through free and fair elections, that's authoritarian. And when you constrain political choice in that way, some degree of repression is going on. And so we can think about authoritarian systems on the spectrum, really, of countries that are more repressive, like a North Korea, or even I would put China as among the more repressive, to authoritarian countries that are maybe a little bit less repressive, someplace like Singapore. But the Chinese system has always had human rights abuses baked into it because the Chinese Communist Party just doesn't allow people to organize politically independent of the party. Now, what we've noticed in the last decade or so is that things have just gotten worse. In the 2000s, which is when I personally started going to China, there was some civil society in China. There was a little bit more openness to the outside world, to foreigners and foreign ideas. And while the country was not anywhere close to democratic, it seemed to be a little bit softer in terms of the nature of the authoritarianism that was going on. Under Xi Jinping, he really just relies heavily on repression to send a message to the population, especially certain groups that he views as threatening. And I've already listed a few of them. But the party is run by Han men. Han is the dominant ethnic group. And so anybody who's not in those groups is sort of inherently somewhat threatening to the party. Not all minority groups are threatening, but we see the party differentially target members of the Uyghur minority group, Tibetans, Hong Kong, which is a whole different case. It's under a separate kind of political arrangement with Beijing, has also come under the party's increasing control in the last few years. And so human rights abuses are just core to the system, and they create a sticking point in U.S.-China relations that I think is always going to be there.
Talking about something that's perhaps a little bit more recent or that's been evolving lately, and it's been at the forefront of my mind a lot. Especially my school had high school graduation a couple of days ago. So, talking about immigration concerns for Chinese students, recently Secretary Rubio announced that the State Department would quote aggressively revoke student visas of Chinese nationals, and that Chinese students quote with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields end quote would be targeted. From your perspective, what's going on here, and what are the potential impact of these students not pursuing their studies in the U.S.?
So this is an issue that's really important to me. I teach PhD students, many of whom are Chinese. I work at a university, and many of our students in other fields are Chinese nationals. And so this is really core to the university community. And talk a little bit about the narrative around Chinese students and then what I think a correction that's needed. There's a narrative in some of the media that Chinese students are engaging in espionage on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, that they're basically agents of the party, so-called non-traditional intelligence collectors that are on our campuses, stealing technology and bringing it back to China and helping its military. Um, Now, there is a degree of this going on. I work on a university campus, and I do think, there are bad actors. There are hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in the country, and there are some that are engaging in bad behavior. And you can look at the headlines and you can find cases. But sometimes what I think what's missing is a sense of context and of scale. And so we have some cases in the media about Chinese students engaging in bad behavior. But for me, the vast majority, and by vast majority, I mean over 99% of Chinese students are here simply to learn. They want to get their degrees. Many of them want to become American, and they're actually studying in the US because they don't like the political climate in China. And so what's happening is I think all of this sort of targeting of Chinese students by the US government is pushing them away. And this is a population that is really core to our scientific enterprise and core to innovation. And I think we should be, for the most part, welcoming them with open arms and trying to help them navigate a very difficult political situation. Many of them are actively monitored by the Communist Party when they come to the West. They have family back home. If they do sensitive research, their families might be targeted. So these are people that are caught between the U.S. government and then a pretty brutal authoritarian government at home. And I think it's important that we work with them and try to socialize them into American political culture and also protect them to the extent we can from overreach from their own government. So that's my point of view. It's a bit different than what one might hear in the media, but I think it's important that I worry a lot that we're villainizing this population of students that is really just extraordinary, and I think should play an important part in our universities and our scientific enterprise moving forward.
I think it's so interesting how these students might not like the political climate of China, but we're also seeing a rise of authoritarianism here. So, kind of talking about Trump's administration, as we're approaching the 6 month mark, much is being written about core democratic principles, including the rule of law, an independent judiciary, checks and balances, the criticality of due process, especially in detention and deportation cases, and even reduction in government spending, as we're seeing play out in Washington at present. In fact, many political scientists, legal scholars, and political leaders across the political spectrum are making comparisons to other countries, including China. Do you think these comparisons are legitimate? And if so, what are lessons from other countries' experiences which Americans can learn to prevent what many are calling a democratic backslide?
So I'm glad you use that term, democratic backslide, which is a phrase that's kind of jargony. It's political science jargon, but it's also a term we should all be talking about more. Backsliding almost, I think, is a weird verb here because it suggests you're moving backward to something. And because the US has such a long democratic tradition, it doesn't quite resonate with people. But democratic backsliding is simply the idea that in certain democracies, democracy itself can erode to the point where the system no longer is democratic. And democratic means having free and fair elections where the person who loses the election leaves power gracefully, right? That's what democracy is all about. And what we've observed across the world in the last couple decades is a number of once robust democracies elect someone into office that in turn uses that power to tilt the playing field, to consolidate power, to block opposition, to attack civil society, to attack the media, to attack universities. And then by the time there's another election, the election is no longer free and fair. It's no longer competitive. And the country might feel democratic. It still has the core institutions. It might be confusing to people what's going on. And the countries generally slide into something we call competitive authoritarianism, which is that they're authoritarian countries that hold elections, but the elections are not really fair. So when we look at Trump I'm a political scientist, I study authoritarian government. I view Donald Trump as fundamentally an authoritarian political figure. I think he does not respect the core institutions of democracy. I think he tried to overturn the results of the 2020 election. I think he spent the past few months in office eroding checks and balances, calling on judges to be impeached that disagree with him, uh, firing people in the federal government, instituting loyalty checks in the high levels of the federal government. There's bills to remove presidential term limits. There's been a partisan remake of the DOD and of the FBI. I could go on. He's attacking universities. He's removing the different journalists from the press room that disagree with him. He's targeting law firms. He's eroding civil liberties of international students, on and on and on. So for me, this is a fundamentally critical juncture for democracy. I think Trump poses a challenge to democracy. I think comparisons, it's important to make the right comparison. A lot of people compare Trump, people compare him to Hitler and call him a fascist. I think this is not the right comparison to make because then it makes that sound kind of a crazy accusation because people look at Hitler and they're like, well, Trump is not bent on world domination and he's not trying to perpetuate a Holocaust. So I think it's important if we're going to compare Trump to people to compare him to the right set of people. And one common comparison is to Viktor Orban in Hungary. Hungary once had something resembling democracy in Orban, who's a kind of a right-wing political figure, similarly charismatic like Trump, used the power of his office in the last 10 years to fundamentally tilt the playing field in his favor. And so this isn't Hitler, this isn't, world domination and Holocaust, but it's still quite nefarious in its own way. And so I think there are plenty of cases, whether it's Hungary or Brazil or South Korea's recent flirtation with authoritarianism. There are a lot of cases in recent years that do really resemble what's happening in the US, and I think we should be learning from them.
I love to stick with for a moment what you were talking about in terms of attacking universities. As we're seeing at Harvard and Columbia and many other universities and colleges, there's almost a daily attack on academic freedom, on independent research, and as you mentioned, core principles, but specifically of the First Amendment. Perhaps related to the question on authoritarianism, what are similarities between what's happening in the US this year and what you've observed in other countries?
Well, I think authoritarian countries and authoritarian governments, there's an inherent distrust of universities, and of intellectuals, of professors, of people who are receiving education, of science. And I think the reason is because universities tend to be bastions of progressive political thought, and most authoritarian regimes are are closed. They are kind of anti-democratic by definition. And so there's just this inherent tension there. And I think for the modern day GOP, there's been this realization that universities are the enemy. That's nearly a direct quote from J.D. Vance. I'm trying to remember the exact wording, but in different forum, he's talked about how universities are basically indoctrinating younger people into thinking a certain way and therefore need to be taken down a size. And so I view what is happening to Harvard and Columbia and places like it. It's being done on the pretext of combating anti-Semitism. There's been actually discussions of the China threat as well, and also terrorism and kind of militant Islam in Palestine. There's these kind of trifecta of security issues that are being discussed, but in my mind, are just basically a pretext through which to attack these universities. And so it's insane that a government that is claiming to want to compete with China is simultaneously destroying the country's greatest research institution. I just we need to understand just how insane that is as a national security strategy. And the damage to Harvard and other places, the American people rightly won't care about Harvard because there's a feeling of elitism. Harvard has not done enough. And I work at Princeton, which is a comparable institution. I think these places have not done enough to show their value to the American people, to express gratitude to the American people, to engineer social mobility. I think there's should be some inward thinking at these places about how they can do more for everyday Americans. But at the same time, it's not a good strategy for the US to destroy its own research institutions. And so I think that's basically what's going on here. And I do consider it kind of a broader part of Trump's authoritarian impulse. We've seen similar things, again, with Hungary being a prominent example. Orban attacked CEU, which is a prominent university there, because he viewed it as hostile. So this is something that does happen in these kind of backsliding democracies.
What are some things you think universities and colleges could do to more directly connect with the American people so that we can feel how heavily attacks on them would be to us?
Well, I view universities as engines of science and innovation and economic growth. You know, the reason why Harvard receives hundreds of millions and even billions in research funding, despite having billions in its endowment, is because Harvard is home to some of the country's greatest scientists, and they're using that money to innovate and create. And I don't think we do enough to kind of show those contributions to society. And this isn't just Harvard. There are 3,000 or 4,000 institutions of higher education in the United States. And I think they're all different little engines of economic activity that really matter to their communities. And I don't think that's understood or broadcast or appreciated enough. So that would be one, is to try to do a better job selling the university, not just being in the ivory tower, so to speak, getting out there and communicating what universities are doing and how it matters to people. The second thing is I do think there needs to be a bigger conversation about social mobility and universities as lifting people up, and playing a part in the American dream. I think some universities do a very good job of this. If you look at the UC system, for example, the University of California system, we see a lot of students coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds entering into the UC system. Often they go to community college for a year or two first, and then go to the UCs, which are very affordable for in-state residents. And that really does make an impact on their long-term earnings and their kind of economic status. I think certain universities do this very, very well, public universities in particular. I think places like Harvard or Princeton, I think there's some degree of this going on, but they still have a fair amount of replicating social inequality, attracting very elite students from very elite high schools, and that cuts against that social mobility. So I think social mobility needs to be a big part of it. And then the final thing is I do think diversity of thought plays an important part. This is an uncomfortable conversation at universities, but I do think there is a little bit of a dynamic where these places are attracting faculty, staff, administrators that are largely thinking in one part of the political spectrum. And this can create real challenges for conservative students and can create dynamics of self-censorship on campus. And we need universities to foster real academic debate across the range of the ideological spectrum. And I don't know exactly how one engineers that, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that that's part of this concern. Like if conservative students, if young conservative people do not feel welcome on campus, they're going to attack campuses and they're going to shun higher education. And I think higher education is really important for everybody. And so I think that's the third piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and especially pointing out social mobility and then the importance of civil discourse. Using that to shift over to advice for young people. This is kind of our advice column of the podcast. At present, and a lot of what we've talked about, make current events seem like very bleak times. I'm sure you're discussing this with your students, but for our listeners, especially those in high school and college, how do we do several things concurrently? One, stay informed without letting this cynicism overwhelm us. Two, play an effective role to help things on a better path, as I think many in my generation feel that we're at a turning point right now, as in, if we don't right this ship now, there may be no turning back. And then third, for those in high school who haven't yet had a class in foreign policy or IR, how would you advise they gain some exposure?
Ah, I wish I had the answers. I feel for you all, and I look at the world. I have two children that are quite young, 4 and 7 years old. But I look at the world that they're inheriting, and you can't help but feel for them, right? Because the planet is warming, democracy is eroding, AI is dominating the economy and creating strange incentives, and it's confusing to people. So it does. We are at this moment where change is happening on so many levels so quickly that it's difficult to keep pace and it's hard not to be a little anxious about the world. And so I think it's important to just acknowledge that feeling is valid. I think for me, what I found for myself and for my own students is, the path of least resistance is to just tune out, right? Like you can just become nihilistic or politically apathetic. And that's one coping mechanism. But I would strongly, strongly discourage people from doing that. And if anybody is listening to your podcast, that means they are tuning in. And I think apathy is the friend of authoritarianism. This is kind of an adage, right? Like authoritarian governments like their citizens disengaged, not paying attention, distracted. And if we are concerned about the stability of our own democracy, now is the time to tune in more than ever. And so I would say, even though it might be a little bit painful and nerve-wracking and infuriating, it's important to be paying attention because now is the time. And I think one way to kind of overcome those negative feelings of that is to not just listen and pay attention, but take action. I've always found, and this is true of my own life, like when I'm doing something, even if I'm not really changing things or if I'm not, I'm not powerful, I don't hold office, I don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But even if I'm taking action, it does help and it makes you feel a sense of empowerment, and that empowerment is infectious. And democracy isn't just about Congress people or judges, it is about citizens. And all these little minor actions we take, whether it's listening to a podcast or having a conversation with a friend or a family member or going to a protest, all of those actions matter because the collective sum of them is what creates our society and our civil society. It's what binds us together. And so I would say pay attention and do something. This is a time to be active, probably more active politically than people have ever been in their lives. And so that's generally the advice I give to a lot of people, not just young students. The other advice I would say is to find your issue. I think the people I look at who are my age or my students who have just graduated, the people who have found kind of professional fulfillment are those who have figured out the issue that they care about and the means to work on that issue. And you might not solve the problem, you might not stop global warming or stop the death penalty or whatever issue it is you're working on. But if you figured out the issue, you can at least look yourself in the mirror and say you're working on something that matters. And so that's, I think, what your life stage is about for high school students or people who are just leaving high school, maybe going to college, maybe going to a trade, whatever they're doing, finding the issue that they care about, that they can work on either in their career or in their personal time. I think that's critical. I'm blabbing now. You asked me what was the last question? It was about foreign policy expertise.
Yes. How would you advise some of us who haven't had a class in foreign policy or IR to gain some exposure to that world?
Well, I think learning a language is really important. And I do worry about language learning if we look ahead 5, 10, 20 years. Given what AI can do, where it can just basically simultaneously translate things, will we still be learning languages in a couple of decades, or will we just rely on these systems to do it for us? I've learned Chinese. I've struggled with Chinese my whole life. Some days it's very good, some days it's not so good. But the struggle has been so rewarding for me, and that language has been a gateway to understanding a place. And so there's a lot of beautiful languages, and I would recommend young people to continue to try to learn them, even though it's difficult. I think that effort, that challenge, those linkages that are formed in your brain are just so healthy and rewarding. And so I think language is the gateway to understanding a place. And so pick a language or pick a place and go from there. And if you can, study abroad. I think that's always a valuable experience. And within a few years, you'll find that you do have some insight to a place. And then the history and the culture, those will all start to come into play. So I think it's similar to what I just said about finding your issue. For some people, the issue is a place, and that's actually kind of how I've always thought about my own careers. Like my issue is China. I'm not going to change China, but I can help people understand it, and I can help the US think about appropriate ways to respond to the challenges posed by China. And so I think just studying a place, studying a foreign policy issue is another route to go that I've personally found very rewarding.
I love that, and especially the message of being driven by your passion and letting that kind of dictate where you go and how you might impact these issues or just spread knowledge about them. One final question for our listeners who would like to follow your articles and perspective in these times. Where would the best place to do that be?
Oh gosh, well there's nothing more sad than a middle-aged man promoting his self social media. I've been writing these days. I write a Substack called Living in Truth, and it's about authoritarianism and democracy in the US and elsewhere. And so it's kind of a newsletter format. People can sign up and you get emails every week or so. So it's just called Living in Truth. It's on Substack. And I'm starting something called the Civic Forum, which you can find at www.thecivicforum.com, which is like a kind of a, I don't even know what it is. It's just not a good sign. It's kind of like a webinar video podcast thing with people who are leading scholars and practitioners of democracy. And it's just about, yeah, the moment we're in. And it will be every Thursday at noon, some conversations with me and other people, kind of like a podcast format. So I'm just starting that. And that would be another way to keep tabs with me if anybody actually wants to. So I appreciate you, Mana, giving me a chance to plug some of my stuff.
No, of course. Thank you so much for everything that you shared and for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate coming on.